Thank you very much for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is LeClaire. I'm with Fuse Technical Group. Been working in all manner of video production for about 10 years now. I was kind of fortunate to be involved in some of the formative productions in virtual production, and then I've also worked in a bunch of other areas helping connect the dots between content pipeline and engineering systems. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about feedback. All right. Talk a little bit about 2.5D content workflows for virtual production or in-camera visual effects specifically. So this is developed into a bit of a buzzword, but it's derived from some really well-established workflow in the VFX world. So we're going to talk about some of the creation techniques and then also how to adapt it into virtual production. So I'm going to stand off to the side here. Windows. All right. So like I said, some of the traditional applications in visual effects with 2.5D compositing or digital matte painting is a process of breaking down otherwise two-dimensional imagery into 3 dimensions as mostly a way to kind of economize the process of filling in background material. Like rather than modeling out every aspect of the environment, you can kind of break things down either from artistic renders or from photographic source and get a lot of bang for your buck essentially as far as that imagery. Turns out a lot of the similar things apply in the virtual production realm, so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And kind of why I started exploring this and what we're looking at it as a content format is it can help alleviate a lot of the challenges of getting content to screen in virtual production. It's kind of one of the bigger challenges in any production pipeline, and this can kind of help offer some efficiencies while maintaining a photoreal look. It can also enhance the capabilities of typical video plate-oriented workflows, because like a lot of what we call virtual production or ICVFX is still just basically an animated translate. You know, it's a video background or car process or whatever, and with a little bit of post-work, you can enhance those visuals and get a lot more mileage out of them. And yeah, basically, how do we economize that pipeline from getting from content to screen and something that is able to be photographed? So some of the concepts involved here are your standard plate photography, but also concepts like camera projection, which are already central to virtual production, as well as 3D modeling and UV texturing, and texture baking as part of the technical pipeline for how to achieve this. So we're going to break the workflow down into 4 basic steps. We've got capture, processing, delivery, and display. So we don't have a whole lot of time here today, so we're going to skip over most of capture. But to cover some of the software, one of the things I set out to do is how to do this on an economy of software. Like what is the cheapest we can go, basically? Because almost all of this can be achieved with Nuke or Houdini or any other visual effects package, but they come at considerable cost and quite a learning curve. So I have a lot of background in digital art, so kind of tried to compare and contrast existing tools and see what sort of workflow could be put together. So kind of what I landed on was a mixture of Affinity Photo, Blender, and Octane Render to come up with like a pretty lean content pipeline for producing this imagery. And to go over some of the goals is, establishing an affordable and repeatable process for creating photorealistic content, and establish a workflow with affordable and readily available DCC tools. Again, Blender's free, I love it, and it's actually really great for this application. And then also establishing a workflow that's capable of producing a deliverable that can work in any renderer. So there's a lot of real-time renderers out there. There's Unreal Engine, Notch, Touch Designer, Disguise. Basically, the workflow can land in any of these gracefully. So kind of at the start, capture, in our case, we're looking at like photorealistic imagery. So stands to reason it's going to come from a photographic source. In this case, we're going to work from a single HDRI, which is a pretty common asset in any visual effects production, that they're typically shot in order to capture lighting environments, key moments, and then can be used for image-based lighting in post, except in our case, we're going to use it live. So this is the source image courtesy of Polyhaven, which is an awesome resource for free HDRIs. And starting with processing, in Affinity Photo, we do paint work to kind of separate the image into slices or sections. And then moving into modeling, we'll start to project that imagery out onto geometry. So kind of to illustrate, the first step of the process is taking the source image, painting out a lot of the occlusion objects into discrete layers. It's things that can be transported into the next step of the process. In this case, it's all high dynamic range EXR pipeline. So moving on from there, this is like the infill or the backplate. You can see all of the arches that were previously in the foreground have been removed. And admittedly, this is rather crude. I'm not a VFX artist, but you can get away with quite a bit because more often than not, it's blurred out in the background anyway. So and then here's the layer with just the arches and then some additional detail. And these are essentially the three main layers for what's going to construct the image. Take it into Blender and model out the geometry, which we'll look at in more detail here in a moment. But then the entire image environment gets baked down to a single raster map. And what this allows us to do is just have a single transport, be it video or still, to capture that entire environment. And then the deliverable set essentially becomes a 3D model, which is very rudimentary, it's not detailed, and then a baked down raster map. And and that can be transported through any number of intermediate formats. It could be FBX, USD, whatever. And depending on the capability of the real-time renderer, this can also include animations. So if you have trees waving, that sort of thing, it can all be baked in. That's particularly true with like universal scene description. And then for delivery, we bake everything down to a single raster. So this is essentially what it looks like. Mostly nonsense, but to like a game developer, this probably looks pretty familiar. So going on from here, we look at display. So we'll take a second actually just to back up and look at this in Blender. So after working through and projecting out and just roughing out geometry based on the source image, you can start to see how we can create sort of that parallax effect we're always after, right? Like that's the whole point of this, that we work in 3D. Except in this case, we can work from a photographic source, and it just shortens the road to photorealism based on pretty well-established pipeline. So this renderer does not like it when my computer's unplugged, but this is essentially the geometry that's being projected into. So this all gets packaged up, baked down, and sent over to a renderer. In this case, I'm using Touch Designer, but like I said, it can work in Notch, Unreal Engine, Disguise, anything that is currently set up for an ICVFX pipeline. And if it ever launches, there we go. And then here's our result. So down in the lower right here, we get essentially a nice, pretty convincing background. In this case, it has some depth of field applied to it. But any sort of post effects that want to be applied are, it's just kind of a typical workflow from there. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But yeah, here's the final renderer. So obviously a little rough around the edges in certain areas, but like I said, more often than not, this stuff is blurred out in the background. So once you apply a little bit of post-processing, it's pretty convincing in camera. And then it can be rendered, like here's sort of a pseudo volume with your inner outer frustum and everything. So it's kind of a sort of a condensed version of a pipeline to create this sort of imagery. Some of the applications this could really. Yeah. Some of the applications this can be good for is pretty much any production requiring photorealistic backgrounds. Reshoots or additional photography could be really good if you already have the HDRIs to work with. And then also just expanding adjustability of typical animated backdrops. There are a number of advantages and disadvantages, as with any workflow. So some of the advantages I've already gone over. Like you can kind of shorten your path to photorealism, and with like a relatively minimal amount of labor, you can kind of cash in pretty good on this photographic sources. Some of the disadvantages is you lose a little bit of the immediacy of adjusting the lighting environment that you get out of Unreal Engine, for instance, or another game engine. The scene also only works in a certain area because all the capture is taking place from a certain point. So you kind of lose detail the further you deviate from that. And then you can also get yourself into a position where you need to support some very high resolution video playback in order to use it. But all in all, the compromises tend to outweigh the gains, and it tends to work out rather well in production. Future going forward, there's a lot of advancement in AI as far as processing this type of footage. Like there's already existing, VFX and photogrammetry and stuff like that to kind of assemble this imagery, but now there's stuff like NVIDIA NERF and some other AI frameworks that are making strides daily on being able to produce stuff like this with just your cell phone. So it's pretty exciting from a content creation standpoint and a kind of production workflow standpoint, honestly. So yeah, that's kind of it. Are there any questions?
For these assets that you are converting, is there like what kind of megapixels should you require?
Oh, good question. Typically for like a spherical content, I would only consider minimum 8K for in-camera work. In this case, it's a 16K or lat long or spherical image.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but that requirement goes down if you start, like you can composite in video elements of a narrower shot and things like that. But as an overall raster, that's kind of the ballpark that you're dealing with.
Gotcha.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Let's give Jared a hand.
Thanks, everyone.